Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Alexandre Gambit, which starts out with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, getting into the Italian game, and then bishop here to c5. Now, the last video I did was on the Lucchini Gambit, and that was after your opponent played d3. We played the move f5, one of my favorite openings. If you haven't checked that out, I definitely recommend it. But a lot of people said, hey, d3 is not the most common move. What happens if they play the move c3, which is by far the most common move from white? This sets up the move d4. It sets up the move b4. And so I said, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into what happens if they play c3, and now we play f5. Very different. Has a lot of the same principles, but this is the Alexandre Gambit. So if you watch that video or are just curious, maybe you have not seen that video yet, but you're curious, yeah, I come across this opening quite a bit. They play c3. How do we respond? This is going to be going over what happens if we play f5. Now, the four variations that I will be going over in this video, the first one is the accepted line they just take here on f5. The next one is if they play b4. Pretty common in this opening to play c3 and then b4. We're also going to be looking at if they play the move d4. Hey, we're attacking the center of the board. They're going to counterattack in the center of the board, attacking our bishop here on c5, which is a very dangerous piece as it eyes down on this f2 square. And then the last variation we are going to look at is castling on the king side. So without further ado, let's go and jump into the Alexandre Gambit. So the first variation is if they accept our gambit here on f5. Anytime you give up material, you want to gain something back for that pawn. And so we're going to be playing the move pawn to d5. This opens up for our light square bishop to get involved, capture this pawn here on f5 at some point, get that material back. But also you can see we're really controlling the center of the board. We have the only e pawn on the board, and also this pawn here on d5 is going to kick this bishop away, or at least it should. I mean, they're probably going to play bishop here to b5, probably their best move. Kick it back here to b3. I guess they could get pretty aggressive if they wanted to counterattack in the center, d4. So we'll look at each of those options and see how we would continue. Bishop to b5, I think, is the most logical play for them. And then we're going to play the move knight to e7. It's a little awkward if we don't, because they do have the move knight takes here on e5. And that just puts both the knight and the bishop attacking this knight here on c6. And this knight is pinned down. It cannot move because of the king here on e8. So I think the best move is knight to e7. This defends the knight here on c6. Also attacks the pawn here on f5. What this does allow white to do is come in and take this pawn here on e5. If you're playing a gambit, you have to be open to the idea of giving up material for a very strong attack. And that's what we're going to be doing in this opening, and especially in this variation. So we gave up one pawn here on f5. We're giving up another pawn here on e5. We're going to go ahead and castle on the king side. You can see white's just moving their same material over and over. They've moved their bishop multiple times. They've now moved their knight multiple times, and they don't have any other material that's really developed or can really get involved into the game. The bishop here on c1 is blocked by the pawn. This knight here on b1 really can't go anywhere. Knight to a3 at some point. Neither of the rooks are involved into the game, and you can see from black's standpoint, a lot of material is already extremely active here. So we're attacking this pawn right here. We can gain some material back. We can obviously take this knight here if we want to. This knight on c6 is no longer pinned. From here, I think we're typically going to see pawn to d4. I'm going over what I think is the most logical moves, the main lines that you'll see. If you don't see these, it typically is going to be a mistake. I'm looking at the best alternatives that white has, and so if you see something crazy, just look for how black can really attack the opponent. Okay, so this is attacking our bishop right here. I think we're going to go ahead and take the knight here on e5. They have a couple options. They could take our knight. They could take our bishop. If they decide to go ahead and take our bishop, then we're just going to play knight takes here on f5. If they castle, now we can attack the bishop. Bishop comes back here. That's completely fine. If we come back and say maybe they take our knight instead, okay, now we just play bishop takes here on f5, maybe castle on the king side. knight to g6, we're attacking this pawn here on e5. Black's going to have a pretty solid game from here. Coming back to this position, instead of coming here to b5, the bishop could also just retreat back to b3, and we're going to push forward with e4. And this is going to be a common theme you'll see throughout this opening here, is pushing the pawn here to e4, attacking this knight. Now, the knight's not going to come here to e5, because then we could just easily take it right here. You can see a free piece. So instead, they could say knight to d4. They could also counterattack in the center of the board with d4. So let's take a look at both of those. The first one being knight to d4. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and take with our bishop. After they take ours, we're going to go ahead and take with our bishop here on f5. And we have a pretty good setup here. You can see that both sides are equal in material. They have double pawns here in the center with no pawns to protect on either the E file or the C file. Black can still castle on either side of the board, so a lot of flexible options here. And so I think this is going to be a really good spot for Black. If we come back, instead of playing knight to d4, if they try to just counterattack in the center of the board, pawn to d4, we're going to go and take material, because if they take, we can take here. And things get pretty difficult for them. Like, we're attacking their rook. They almost need to play rook here to g1 because they don't have any other threats. This bishop here on b3, it's being stopped by the pawn here on d5, which is crucial because if they try to get their queen involved into the game, okay, well, it doesn't have any other material to help. So we can just play g6. And they can't just take here looking to do anything else, because we're just going to take their rook here on h1, check, and we have a queen. So that's not going to work. They realize they have to move their queen back. Then we just play queen to e7. Yes, they could exchange right here, but at the end of the day, they're eventually going to have to play rook to g1. And now we can come up here with e5, putting a lot of pressure on our opponent. We have knight up to f3 as a move. We also have the move knight to d3. So a lot of threats that we have, and we can also just take this material here on f5, get that pawn anytime we want to. All right, so last thing we'll look at for this variation is, instead of coming here to b5 or retreating back to b3, they could also just counterattack in the center of the board with d4. Say, hey, if you're going to take my bishop, I'm going to go ahead and take your bishop as well. Hey, we are definitely going to take their bishop. There's no doubt about that. If they don't play b5 or b3, we're definitely taking their bishop. If they take ours, that's fine as well. We can now exchange our queens. They have to take with their king right here. Now we can play bishop takes on f5, getting that material back here. And now let's say knight to d2. We castle on the queen side. Their king has already moved, so it cannot castle. It's going to be in the center of the board here. We're going to be looking at knight to f6, get both of our rooks in the center of the board. We should have a pretty good game from here as well. So that's what happens if they decide to take with the pawn early on with pawn takes here, f5. The next variation we are going to look at is the move pawn to b4. It says, hey, we want to attack this bishop, and we know that you already have a defender here with your pawn on e5, so we're not ready to push forward here with d4. But unfortunately, this falls because if they just play pawn to b4, we are immediately playing bishop takes here on f2. Extremely strong move. If they take, it's not good for them, but they almost have to take, because if they just play king to f1, then we take with our pawn here on e4, attacking the knight here. And what do they really do from here? The knight doesn't have any good options. It can't come back here to d1 or d2. It can't come back here to h2. If it comes here to g5, it's just going to fall to our queen. It can't come here because that's protected by our knight here. So it just doesn't have a lot of good options. Probably just take with the king now, but then we take with our pawn, and they're in a world of trouble. We can get our queen involved into the game now, and their king is completely exposed. So they pretty much have to take with their king here on f2. But then the same thing, we play pawn takes e4, attacking this knight right here. Where does the knight go to? Well, first they may just decide exchange some material right here, because our threat of knight to f6 getting involved could get pretty frustrating for them. But knight comes back to e1. They just don't have too many safe squares, and now we play queen to h4. So yes, we did sacrifice a bishop here on f2, but the king is going to be exposed the rest of the game. We're going to be attacking it. Now we can play pawn d5, getting our light square bishop involved into the game. We're just going to be putting so much pressure on our opponent. So if they play b4, I am all about it because I am going to be ready to attack for the rest of the game. Don't have to worry too much if they play this pawn to b4. Now, the best move they can play is d4. I don't know how many people will actually try this variation, but it is very difficult for black to find an advantage. So I think it's important as we go over any chess opening to make sure you understand where the weaknesses are. And I do think that white has the upper hand if they play correctly, and that is d4. Now, black still has a lot of attacking lines, and they do have to play correctly. We are going to first take here on e4. Attacking the knight, I think they're pretty much always going to just take here on e5. They could also take our bishop, so we'll look at that variation as well. But knight takes here on e5 makes a ton of sense to me. We go ahead and take with our own knight, and then they take our knight right here. Yes, they could take our bishop, but that would be a mistake because then we could just take their bishop here with our knight. So I'm going to assume that they're going to play correctly, take our knight right here, then we're going to play queen to e7, preparing to attack that pawn. Now, if they don't play knight to e5, maybe they decide to go ahead and take our bishop here on c5. That's fine. We're going to go ahead and take their knight here on f3. If they take with their queen, great. We're going to play knight to f6. We have to stop the threat of queen down to f7. This would be checkmate. Can't allow that to happen. So knight to f6, stopping that. If they come down and attack that knight, that's completely fine. Doesn't really matter because if they play bishop takes here, okay, we're just going to take with our queen. And we don't even care if they come down in exchange. That's completely fine as well. But all of these variations, I do think white comes out with a pretty good game setup. I mean, black's not in a terrible spot by any means, but all the other variations I'm going over, I do think black has a slight advantage. This is one that I do think white is able to maintain their advantage. So we'll come back. The last variation that we are going to look at, instead of playing pawn to d4 in the center of the board, the last variation is if they play castle on the king side. Now, if you've been paying attention in the rest of the video, you probably know what the next move, and that is pawn takes here on e4. Now, my hope is that if someone actually plays this from white's standpoint, that they actually feel like they can't really move their knight anywhere. That maybe knight to e1 is really their only option, which would be a terrible move. Moving the knight back, blocking off the rook here on f1. Black should be able to just completely overwhelm the opponent, because if they look at it and say, man, knight takes here on e5, well, it's not protected. They can just go ahead and take material right here. That is true, but they do have the move queen to h5. This is pretty much forcing the move knight to g6. And so I do think that they have ways to get back into the game, but some players may just not play that knight to e5. But if they do, we're actually not going to take this knight. Now, we hope that they feel like we're going to, but we're actually not going to because of the setup I just showed you. Instead, first we're going to play the move pawn to d5, attacking the bishop. Now let's say they attack our knight here on c6. We're going to go and take with our pawn here. Now if they come down to, queen to h5, we're going to play the move king to f8. You have to be careful here. You can't play g6 because they're going to fork our rook here, and then we play king d7. They take our rook here on h8. Like, things just do not go well for us. So we have to be careful as far as what we play. So we're just going to play the move pawn to c6, and then we should be in a good spot after queen to h8 if they want to. Then we just play king to f8. But then we're going to be looking to play knight to f6. We can also take the bishop here on c4. I think this is the way that black wants to attack it. Does not have to worry about too many threats. that white has right now. You can still see that this dark square bishop is blocked in. This knight here on b1 is blocked in. And that's part of the reason that we can start to attack our opponent once they play c3, is it really boxes in this knight here on b1. You really are only looking at knight to a3 that's ever going to get this knight involved into the game. And since the knight's not moving, the rook here on a1 is not going to be involved in the game as well. So that is the Alexandre Gambit. So I know a lot of people, they got excited once they saw the Lucchini Gambit, and they said, hey, I love the idea of playing this f5, but what happens if our opponent plays the move c3? Well, hopefully this video gives you an idea of how you can attack it. I think black has a really, really good game plan. If you are playing from white's standpoint, I do think the best option is to play that move pawn to d4. But hopefully this builds out your repertoire of moves that you can play in the Italian Giuoco Piano. This position right here, you know, if they play c3 or d3, you should now be locked and loaded. So again, thanks so much for watching this video. If you have a video recommendation, this video I just made was a recommendation from someone on my last video. So if there's something you want me to make, feel free to let me know. You can email me. You can leave a note in the comments below. Either of those will definitely get to me. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.